that you are the master, you are the teacher, you are the guru, you are the healer, you are everything and anything you've been looking for but projecting into the world outside of yourself. But you need to start recording the dreams and make a conscious effort for the communication. And you need to start interpreting as a two-way conversation, not just passively looking at the ideas, but actually asking questions, actually making requests of the dream self, the higher self, the higher genius, God, the daemon. Hey there, sinners, it's Adam Knox, and welcome to yet another episode here on the Cult of You. What if inside of you was a master, a perfect teacher, a healer, and all the gods, right? This is something we've heard expressed differently in different traditions, but it doesn't seem that a lot of those traditions really agree on the path towards it. And for most people, it's a very obscure concept, something that they feel very well removed from. I'm reminded about the sayings from the Gospel of St. Thomas, the living sayings of Jesus, notably a Gnostic text. But one of the statements there is, "Lift a stone and you will find me, break a twig and I am there." It's this notion that we need no intermediary between ourselves and the divine, between humankind and God, rather. This story, I want you to join me in today as I unfold it and make it practical. And as you find out that your dreams are far more useful than you may have considered before. If you are an avid dreamer and someone who is a dream walker and one who works in dreams, you will find perhaps some other tools today that you may have not considered before, different perspectives and interpretation. And if you are nuanced to dreams or don't think that you dream, today's conversation may change your perspective on that a little bit and open you to the probabilities or the possibilities of the master within. Let's get into it, and remember, as always, to live deliciously. Dream practices have been explored in pretty much every tradition. I mean, let's be honest, every human being dreams. And those that say they don't dream, it's not that they don't dream, it's simply that they don't recall their dreams. This could be for many reasons. There's too much going on in the conscious mind, there's too much of life that has to be processed, there's stress, they maybe aren't ready for the dream content in and of itself due to some position of the ego that's trying to repress those ideas as soon as they come up with. It could also be the morning routine. There are several things, including beliefs and a number of other ideas, that could cause us to repress the dream itself. But the dream gate is an important one for each and every one of us in this art, the magical art and the spiritual practices. Now, I've been a proponent for a long time here on the channel, talking about the need to work with active imagination, or shall I say, to work with the imagination in an active way. And in that time, I've highlighted some of the ideas of correspondence, such as on the Kabbalistic tree of life, how we find the word imagination, or the idea of imagination, attributed to that of Tiferet, which also links to the concept of beauty, and as such gives us a nice relationship to that, the beauty that we perceive in this relationship to our imagination, and this frame of what the heart perceives as the truth or the fundamental reality that we find ourselves in. In that, we understand that this imaginative door is essentially a gateway into the unconscious, a gateway into even perhaps the collective and superconscious that sits beyond that. So then what are dreams? What do they mean? Now, there's various assumptions on this subject. One of the most common ones that we find is that dreams are the unconscious's way of processing the additional data of the day, if you will. Now, that could be based upon the concept that the cerebellum takes in 400 billion bits of information, where the conscious mind, the neocortex, only processes about 2,000 bits of information, which again makes sense. I mean, imagine trying to, manage your meeting when you're aware of that extra amount of data. It could be quite overwhelming, considering the limited capacity that we already have in terms of just making decisions, given the idea or the study of decision fatigue. So that is a very plausible argument that this is a way for the mind or the brain to process that additional data and make it aware to the conscious mind, especially since the conscious mind's not really concerned with a lot of that data. I mean, after all, its primary focus is as a deletion creature, as Tony Robbins would say. It deletes the data that's not relevant to its survival and its specific goals and objectives. So anything that's not specifically in that meta frame, that oncology, that paradigm, if you will, gets deleted, gets ignored, so to speak, including things that don't have references. So the unconscious would like to present that to the brain. Now, I'm not saying that's not true. I am saying that's a component of it. So instead of saying that's the whole truth, I'd like to take the position to say that that is one of the building blocks in this Lego set called our dreams. Then there's the other variants of this, right? The ones that we find traditionally in psychology, such as Jungian or Freudian psychology, or many of the others, where we're looking at dream interpretation, especially from the Jungian perspective. In this, the components of the dream are all facets of the self, right? If you dream of grandmother or you dream of father, it's not necessarily father, it's not the disincarnate spirit of an elder who might have passed away, assuming, in this example, the grandmother or the father has passed away already. It is what is the father to you, is the part of yourself that is the father or is the grandmother. What is this representative of? And the symbolic language of it is then interpreted as a portion of the individual's own psyche, which is the Greek word for soul, if you will. The exploration and the unfolding of the psyche is very much the unfolding of the soul, the exploration of the soul, which again makes very clear sense to us if we take this idea it's the soul that goes into heaven or hell, because we know that the experience of heaven and hell is not necessarily a physical one, but a psychic one. It's not that you are in pain or you are in suffering, no matter what the context of the world around you is. It's your neurological interpretation. I'm not saying that in any way to diminish it, but I mean, if we look at the work of Viktor Frankl and the concept of logotherapy, we find that people inside of those circumstances, everyone was in the same circumstances, as horrific as it was. Some people were perishing. They pretty much gave up on life very quickly. Others seemed to actually be thriving and becoming stronger. And the fundamental difference between these people is the mental interpretation, the meaning that was attributed to this thing, which caused the psychic experience to be different of the individual. The soul was either in heaven or hell. The old adage, the mind that maketh a hell out of heaven or a heaven out of hell. So the psyche is a very complex idea, and for us to simply think we can understand it by understanding a facet of it is naive. It's this reductionist way, which, I myself can be guilty of sometimes, and I think all of us can, because, again, the conscious mind is a deletion creature, right? It's trying to eliminate data that's an extra cognitive effort that it cannot see the immediate benefit into. So that's, the second possibility, this idea of the Jungian interpretation of dreams. And I do think, again, that's another element to it. And now we explore the shamanic and the spiritual traditional view of this. And in this perception, if we look at anything from the shamans of Peru to those of the Aborigines in Australia and everything across the board, we will find this perception of dreams being real, or actually being different realities, so to speak. And from the, shall we say, the string theory idea, that's plausible. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that string theory assumes that, but it does assume the probability of multiple dimensions or other worlds, if you will. Let's take that as another assumption that we add in on the stack, that in this interpretation, grandmother actually is grandmother coming through to deliver a message. That has a different perspective, but for the most of it, the interpretation and the message would likely be the same, even though the, shall we say, the core oncology or the core paradigm from which they're being interpreted, in other words, the core narrative, is different. The fundamental message being delivered over to the psyche is still relatively the same. Whether you're saying it's grandmother physically coming to you and saying, you got to do the dishes in your life, quote unquote, and you're taking that as the actual spirit, or you're taking it as my inner grandmother, my inner part that wants to bring in harmony in the life and take care of the family and bring ancient wisdom, is telling me that I should do it. Wherever you're geolocating that component, its interpretation is fundamentally the same. So to get caught up in these arguments is neither here nor there. It's just another attempt to meet our 6 human needs. And in so getting further away from what's the actual important thing, what's the dream trying to deliver us. Now, the full landscape of these variations in dreams are also going to be different across cultures. Right? A certain symbolism, such as the meaning of a dragon, would be different for somebody in the left-hand path as it would be for someone in the right-hand path. Same as the idea of a serpent. It would be different for someone born of Asian descent versus someone born of African descent. The reason for this is because the collective mind of the group, the socio-political development of the group, has gotten them to attribute different meanings to different symbols and different sigils. And a group large enough will have shared dreams. This is something we see in different traditions, such as anything from the Christian apostolics to various shamanic tribes to covens that work their practice together. It's very interesting how when a coven assumes a certain paradigm, a certain, shall we say, system of correspondences, that their dreams begin to follow suit into it. And the reason for this, or the metaphor that I like to use, is that you're sitting in a room, isolated. Its walls are all closed around you, and you've had a certain background or upbringing with a certain belief system and language. And on the other side of the room sits another individual who thinks of life completely different, has a completely different background, has a completely different gender, identity, history. Heck, it may not even be a human being. It may not have the same species in common, but it has intelligence, right? Perhaps an intelligence far greater than your own, because unlike you, it's not restricted to its deep association to people, places, times, things, and events. In other words, its sense of self is not restricted by relationship to those specific things. So it's able to think outside the box. It's free from the notion of time. It's free from the notion of accepted knowledge, or what I would refer to as the elemental self. It's outside of those paradigms and possibilities. So it has great gnosis to share with you, and I love the film Arrival because it's this idea of this lady that goes and they're interacting with these other alien races, and the alien race is trying to teach them a language, and once she grasps the language, she overcomes time. And as odd as that may seem, this is an interesting hypothesis. It's also known as linguistic relativity, and how that our brain's perception is very much dependent upon the language that we actually speak. And somebody that has a more diverse language or more words in their vocabulary will have greater level of experience of reality. And I'm always reminded, about the idea how in modern language we pretty much have 7 to 12 words to describe the concept of love, whereas in ancient Sanskrit we had an excess of 200. Our experience of these things has become so limited or so, varied, and then we try to cancel each other when one doesn't conform to the other one. Again, adding to this further separation instead of this inclusive freedom from these restrictions. However, that little jargon aside, or that little rant aside, you're sitting on the one side of the room, and on the other side of the room, this other individual is speaking. And I'm reminded of all the times in history where we've seen this in various formats. You look at the sisters that really brought spiritualism to the front when they were experiencing these knocks, when they were communicating with the spirit. There's 2 parts of that story. The one part is that they came out at one point and say that all of this was false. And later on, they retracted that statement that it was false. So there is beliefs, or there are arguments that they were pressured to bringing it out as false, and then they retracted. There could be financial motives. We won't know. We weren't there. The other example of this would be John Dee and Edward Kelly. This relationship between these two magicians and the angels known today as the Enochian angels, which doesn't necessarily classify as angels in the traditional pseudo-Christian sense, or even in the Catholic or Kabbalistic sense, represented this hierarchy on the other side. Also, in starting the dynamic, first had to teach them almost their alphabet. They had to teach them first the language. There had to come a common ground of symbols. Because what is language, right? Language is nothing more than a collection of symbols to which we've attributed certain meanings, and by firing them off together, we produce different meanings and different sequences. It's the syntax, if you will, of how we experience the world, and that's what gives the ground of ritual as well. Language is indeed the first true technology of the magician. So when you're starting off in the dreamscape, and this is the thing that I find, the most fascinating of the individual. So again, place all of these components together and let's boil them up stack by stack. There is the interpretation of extra data that's available to the cerebral that's coming forward from the unconscious into the conscious. There's the filter systems, which are the beliefs, the narratives, and the, shall we say, the oncology that the individual lives in. And this is kind of the starting point. And then there's this proverbial other. The other that we experience as a tangible other thing, oftentimes in psychedelics. And one of the fascinating things there is that the information presented is so overwhelming as it collapses old neural networks, and we're receptive to that because we're going through an ego death, that it creates hallucinations, because that's the only way that the brain can interpret this data, very much the same way as the dream experience. So we're experiencing these vivid hallucinations by which we become so associated to them that we forget that this world is the, or shall we not make any assumptions about which one's real, but the simple idea is that we begin to associate the dream world as the real world, and the real world as the dream world. And when we exit out of the dream, we disassociate and say the dream world was now the dream world and the real world is the real world. But which one's which in truth? The fact is that each of these parts of ourselves lives literally in a multi-dimensional reality within our own being. We are multi-dimensional beings, if you will. There's many ways you can interpretate that. You can say conscious, unconscious, subconscious. You could say this realm, that realm. You can do all these different things. The linguistic model that you utilize is personal to you and will determine how you experience that. If they're cold, dead scientific facts, your experience might even be cold and scientific. If they're rich, detailed, spiritual ones, it may open you up to a sense of wonder to it. The language you choose to use may be useful in terms of articulation, to others that speak that same language, but what is the experience it produces within yourself? So now we've got UA and UB sitting in these two opposite rooms. At first, you're not even aware of each other. There's no awareness. And in fact, you've probably ignored it for years. You've been in the same cell or two different rooms for 5, 6, 10, 30 years. And you've pretty much ignored this as just some other prisoners or some other bleeps or some noises in the building or things like that. Every now and again, there was something that seemed like a pattern, but you didn't really take it seriously. So, and you're speaking as if you're completely alone in this space. And I find that's how a lot of people approach spirituality. They go and they pray and they ask questions and they do rituals, and then they're almost looking into outer space, right? And I love that metaphor again of outer space, simply because it's so reflective of us as a species. We have such knowledge of what's going out in the stars and in the other planets and in the Milky Way. We've explored so far, right? But how much knowledge do we really have of what goes on in the deepest level of our seas? And I find the expression there is very interesting, in the sense of the further down we go, the pressure gets too intense and it pretty much crushes us, right? Same way as the going into the dreams has a different type of pressure because it crushes our ego, it dissolves our ego. Versus if we go further out in space, we lose gravity. In other words, we lose touch with our essence, and we even have to artificially breathe. We need oxygen supplies because we can't breathe in that space. Very much in a way as we do social media, how we come in resonance to identify with artificial air or artificial validation or artificial, solutions there, whilst disconnecting the version some of us are on social media, especially on things like Instagram, versus the real version that we are. So I find the irony of our inner outer world reflected in our times very resonant to this notion. So then how do we solve this? Because one day you had a conversation, you popped on a podcast like this, you read a few dream journals, and the dream journal said to you, this means this means that. And you understand now that may be true, but it will probably be true for that group of people that fit that demographic, that has that background and that bloodline perhaps, because that's their narratives. You need to understand it from your narrative, from your symbolism. When you grew up, the symbolism of a cat may be very, very different for you. The symbolism of a dog, of food, of an empty fridge, a full fridge, of the color blue. It's not what you find in the correspondence in different occult and magical systems. Those were the correspondence of the individuals that created them, or the groups that bought into that oncology. And yeah, you could potentially tap into it, but notice how you first need to be trained and it needs to activate before it works. So you can do that, and it's an effective method, especially if you're young and you're learning and you're working with a group. But another method is just to recognize what your own symbolisms are. What does these things mean to you, and to trust you? And I think the reason a lot of people don't do it is because they don't trust the God within. And I'm reminded here of the Gospel of St. Thomas, admittingly a Gnostic text, where Jesus is quoted to say that, break a piece of wood and you will find me, lift a stone and I am there, the kingdom of heaven is within you and all about you. And my philosophy around that is that you are the master, you are the teacher, you are the guru, you are the healer, you are everything and anything you've been looking for but projecting into the world outside of yourself. You've been looking for that neighbor, out the window, yet he's right next door to you, tapping on the door as well, thinking the same thing. So if you change that direction and you now start tapping on that door and you admit that, hey, listen, I know there's something here, let's try and figure out a language, it's going to start tapping back. And in the beginning, that may seem completely random, but if instead of trying to get the whole concept and try and interpret it from your point of view, you simply go, okay, I did this and he gave me 2 taps. Okay? I did that and he gave me 3 taps. So, and you start kind of building up this vocabulary of symbolisms without necessarily initially trying to piece them all together. And once you look at the symbols, now you can look at how they relate together. And the idea that I love here is a concept known as synesthesia. Synesthesia is the overlapping of one sense to another. It's something that we find in severely autistic people, but it's also something we find in psychedelics, right? When you hear color or when you see sound, these are ways where the brain overlaps one sense to the other one. And this is part of how the mind actually works at these deeper unconscious levels. We're mostly filtering it or blocking it through the conscious mind. So to rationally, if the dream comes to you in the morning, to immediately rationalize it is bringing the wrong agent in. You simply want to write down or verbalize. Now, because of the level of the brain in which the dreams operate, it may not be that easy for you to verbalize, because you have to almost disassociate from that part to start verbalizing. So if writing works best for you, great. If voice notes work great for you, self-referred, great, do that. But you need to start recording the dreams and make a conscious effort for the communication. And you need to start interpreting as a two-way conversation. Not just passively looking at the ideas, but actually asking questions, actually making requests of the dream self, the higher genius, God, the daemon, whatever terminology you'd like to throw onto this proverbial other. Once you start doing that and you start putting the things in context, in relationship to what the deep question in your heart or soul is at that time, same way you would handle a divination, then suddenly the symbolism begins to reveal itself, and it's one that evolves, because as you and the sacred other begin to speak, the symbolism starts to refine as you both come to a collective shared understanding of things. And this is very much the psychological stage, if you will. This is the stage where we're in the personal unconscious and we're interpreting the data that comes through this way, the exact same way that happens in mediumship and clairvoyant development. When somebody becomes a medium or they recognize their mediumistic ability and they become clairvoyant, the first messages and even the people that they attract to give messages to are the ones they themselves need to hear the most. It's very interesting how the universe and our spirit works in that way in order to help our own progression and our own development. And that's because before we can truly see clearly into the spiritual, before we can truly become clairvoyant, clairaudient, and so on, we must first clear our own inner eye. In other words, we must first resolve these fragmented parts of ourselves, and again, ourselves become whole. There is a deep progressive spiritual healing before we can become healers to the world, that we must heal ourselves, right? Before you're trying to save the world financially or spiritually, but you save yourself. How about you deal with that in your own life, and then you can go to it with more resources to help others. Now, I'm not saying repress if you can help, but I am saying it shouldn't be at the jeopardy or cost of your own wellness and well-being. If you're already empty, you're just two people suffering. But if you can go and fix the situation, which sometimes requires you to leave, then you can come back with more resources. You want to look at that first stage of communication as this direct guidance. And this is powerful. The reason this is powerful is because it helps break the old scotoma that people have around occultism and magic and spirituality and all these things. They still seem to have that Hollywood phenomena, right? They're going to say a few ritual words and suddenly the demon or the ghost is going to appear outside of them. And again, I'm not saying that's an impossible thing. You've heard some of my conversations, especially the one on the quantum self and the psychology of demonology and many of my others. And if you're in my courses, you've seen my progressive way of dealing with this and exploring this idea from a practical point of view. But the idea or the concept is, or the fundamental essence is, you don't have to wait for that. You don't have to put that as the expectation. In fact, placing that as the expectation is a surefire way for you to miss the clues, right? Because your child, if you're a parent and your kid comes to you with this creativity, but you're so fixed that they need to be a doctor that you pretty much ignore their talent and repress it. And they may try and please you by becoming the doctor, but then later on in life they find out, they just want to be an artist. They just wanted to do this, and they actually have an incredible gift for it, an incredible natural talent for it. So we do the same thing with our own unconscious. We put these expectations on it and how to communicate with us and what the rules are, and that's just not it. And then the second it comes and we go, that's not it, this is what you should do, then we suddenly start repressing it, because what are we doing? We're linking more shame or more judgment to these communicative efforts. This is the exact same reason your shadow has been created. And what we do in shadow work is we allow, without trying to filter, without trying to make perfect or make right or fix, but to give permission to this part of ourselves to express itself in the way that it needs to express itself, to fully accept it, to fully have it be heard or integrated. And only once that's done, now we can offer it, we can lead into an alternative expression once that part feels heard. Same thing in any kind of dynamic or relationship with another human being, right? You can dictate and direct them for a very long time, and if you're in a unique kink BDSM relationship, that may be all that is required. But if you want to establish a sustainable long-term relationship, communication is a two-way street. And the way you're going to get good at that is by getting good at this, by getting good at honoring the portions of yourself that want to communicate, and then to understand the dynamics of how it relates as a great, kind, caring messenger that wants to bring you forward in things. Now, when you're beginning, it may be useful, or you may struggle to do these things yourself because you struggle to find the symbolism, right? It's difficult. We're so stuck in our own drama to see beyond it, even if the data is given directly to us. That is why it's sometimes useful to work with a dream group, a coven, people that are trustworthy, that can give you their perspectives, their insights, their alternative views. Doesn't mean you take any of them. And a great idea, and I like how Robert Moss kind of describes it here in his book, Dream Gates, where he says, in those instances, maybe the better thing to say is, if it was my dream, I would think of it this way. And allow the others to do it as well. And you hear these different perspectives. It doesn't mean you take any one as law or truth, but it is different points of view. Ultimately, you yourself alone knows the feeling that you got, the symbolism that those things carry in your own life, and this is the language you need to build up. As you build this up and you start writing this into your grimoire or your diaries, you start to see recurring patterns, recurring symbols. You write those things in, and that's where your correspondence system is really born from. You see, from that true internal correspondence system between you and this other portion of yourself, you're now beginning to establish a relationship with yourself and your spiritual self, if you will. And this is the necessary thing to advance spiritually, to grow in these other areas. And you may choose to give a name to it. I have a name for mine, but you may choose to just look at it as the different parts. You can take a polytheistic or a monotheistic approach. That's all these are narratives, and they will suit you. I teach a system called the Lord of Lies, which is what I refer to as the anti-paradigm, that any paradigm can be installed, uninstalled. That's my old chaos magician approach, but you're welcome to use the one that works the best for you. What I would like to just emphasize here is not to be one of those people that pops onto Facebook and just shares your entire dream narrative. And the reason I say that is quite simple. Anyone that is an adept in enchantment and neurolinguistic programming, hypnosis, or any of these advanced kind of technologies of linguistics and of the mind understands enough of the landscape that should they wish to manipulate you. I'm not saying a lot of people are like that, but let's be honest, there's at least 10% or a few that may. That would be enough data for them to understand your personal mythology, your personal relationship and experience of the world. And that can be used to sell you, and it can be used to influence. And since we are moving into the age of artificial intelligence, the possibility of people with enough data being able to generate maps of meaning or identify your maps of meaning based upon that data that you're happily posting on social media is a real risk. It could be used in advertising and marketing or for more nefarious reasons. So be careful who you share this with. It reminds me of the classic spiritual adages and rules of initiation, keep silent. Right? Keep silent of your mystery with those outside of your trust, outside of your initiation. So bring up, and again, look at the value of a close community, of a close people that you can trust and you can share these ideas with. And again, pop onto the Cult of You, join us, in my demonstraship if that's something that you're into. Pop into one of the other monthly master classes. You'll find links to this all in our primary link, that linktree/the Cult of You. Or just cvlt.co.za, and participate in a community of like-minded individuals that are trying to learn and grow. And it's natural for people to be nervous. It's natural for you not to want to share your ideas because you're afraid of being judged or your position of knowledge. And that's the same thing that I think causes the dissonance in the society of occultism that we have today. It reminds me of programmers and engineers that are too afraid to ask questions because of the assumed status that they have. And we all understand one thing fundamental of status. It may be an effective tool for influence and seduction and sales, but it's a horrible tool for spiritual growth. I'm Adam Knox, and I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. And if you'd like to see more of these kind of things, please do comment, like, subscribe, the whole shebang. But more than that, I'd love to hear from you. What are some ideas in this video that really connected with you? Or maybe what are some other resources or references that you think other people would find valuable, or books or authors that you'd like to see me talk to? Share that in the comments, and let's help each other grow and learn more. I'll see you on the other side, and remember to live deliciously.